Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into one of the darkest slices of French history, where the throne was not only draped in gold and velvet, but also soaked in blood and haunting whispers. Imagine this inside the magnificent Fontainebleau Palace. Beneath towering arches, a boy was born to live as a prince, but grew up in the nightmares of religious wars, schemes, and spilled blood. That boy, later, was called by a name that even history books hesitate to write: the Cannibal Prince of France. And trust me, you might not survive if you hear the whole story tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you are and what time it is where you live. Let's see how many time zones tonight's story will slip through. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Lean back, and I will take you back in time to France in the 16th century, when the scent of lavender in the palace mingled with the damp smell of ancient walls. You hear footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and at the end of the corridor, a boy in a silk robe is walking slowly, his large eyes heavy with weariness. That is Charles, not a conqueror, nor a saint, but a prince of the Valois line, born on a sweltering June day in 1550. Official history records that Charles was never destined to wear the crown. As the fifth son of King Henry II and Queen Catherine de' Medici, he was like the reserve of the reserve in the line of succession. But fate sometimes resembles a long-running television series, constantly shifting direction, one after another. Charles's elder brothers died young, from illness, from frailty, and from the Valois curse, whispered about in Paris. And so, at the age of 10, the boy with thin hands suddenly became the legitimate heir, and only a few years later, the heavy crown was placed upon his head. The problem was, even with the crown, Charles did not truly rule. Power rested entirely in the hands of Catherine, the mother renowned for being as intelligent as she was, cold. Like a stone statue in the palace courtyard, she controlled everything from behind the scenes, from foreign policy down to what her son would wear before appearing at court. Compared to today, you might imagine this as a powerful CEO running the company, while the young director mainly served as the public face, smiling for the photo shoots. One little known fact: Charles had such a fierce passion for hunting that at times he hunted all day long, bringing back so many animals that the royal kitchens could not prepare them in time. It is said that once he returned covered in blood and dirt, as cheerful as if he had just watched his team win a football match. Historians still debate the reason. Was it his way of releasing the pressure of ruling, or simply the wild instinct of a youth trapped by ritual and rules? You can imagine, at the time Charles ascended the throne, France was like a chessboard, overturned. The religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots, were so intense that, if social media had existed then, the feed would have been full of breaking news like clashes erupt in Lyon or riots in Rouen. In such a climate, a young king, already fragile in mind, had to stand between powerful factions, listening to a flood of contradictory advice. Honestly, if you were Charles, you might also have wanted to request an extended leave of absence. Catherine believed in astrology and omens. It was said she often summoned astrologers and soothsayers to court, even mysterious herbalists, to ask about her son's fate. Rumor had it, she carefully chose the exact hour for Charles to sign decrees, so that it would be aligned with the stars. It sounds almost like a modern mother choosing the perfect time to post her child's photo on Instagram, except that here, the wrong timing could start a war. But the story grew far more serious in the year 1572, when Charles was only 22 years old. That was the time of an event history calls the fateful wedding, the marriage between Charles's sister, Marguerite de Valois, and the Protestant Prince Henri de Navarre. In theory, this was a brilliant diplomatic move to reconcile the two religious sides. In reality, the atmosphere inside Paris was like a pressure cooker about to explode. The radical Catholics were suspicious. The Huguenots were wary. And in the middle stood Charles, both the brother representing the family at the wedding, and the king responsible for ensuring the ceremony went smoothly. What few outside the palace knew was that, during those days of celebration, rumors and secret orders spread through the corridors. Some witnesses said Charles often left the banquet early, wandering alone, his eyes chasing invisible things. Historians still argue, was this a sign that he was losing his sanity? Or that he clearly saw the plot forming but lacked the strength to stop it? I know. At this point you may ask, if it were me, what would I do? In truth, the answer is difficult. When every road leads to violence, sometimes people choose silence, even though that silence will haunt them for life. And for Charles, silence was not only a political decision, but also part of his nature. A boy raised in fear, always, with a mother shielding him, yet controlling his every breath. Tonight, you and I will go deeper into that spiral, where a young king stood amid raging tides, and every decision he made was like a step on thin ice. And you will see that history is not only written in victories or defeats, but also in the moments when a human being accepts to trade away part of his humanity, just to keep hold of a crown. Imagine an August night in 1572, Paris dressed in festive garments, but beneath the silk lay threads of blood silently weaving together. Oil lamps hung along the boulevards shone brightly, casting light on the cobblestones worn by horse hooves and wooden clogs. The air carried two clashing scents, the butter sweetness of fresh pastries from the shops near Les Halles, and the invisible but tangible tension so thick you could almost bite into it. You were there, amidst the distant peal of church bells, among wedding music and toasts, yet also in a polarized Paris, where every word could be a secret signal, and every handshake might conceal a knife. The wedding of Marguerite de Valois and Henri de Navarre was staged as a symbol of reconciliation, but Catherine de' Medici, Charles's mother, never believed peace was a free gift. She believed peace, if it existed at all, could only last when the opponent was neutralized. And at that moment, neutralisation meant élimination. Official history records that only a few days after the wedding, on the night of the 23rd into the early morning of the 24th of August, the feast of St. Bartholomew, the first gunshot rang out. It was the shot that signaled a bloodstorm. When the Protestant leader Gaspard de Coligny was attacked in his residence, from then on, like a spark to dry straw, violence spread across Paris. Doors were smashed open. Narrow streets turned into a labyrinth of pursuit. One little-known detail witnesses recalled that before the catastrophe broke out, Charles was seen hurrying down the palace corridor, almost running. His face was pale, and he kept glancing back as if afraid someone was following him. Some believed it was because he had heard the news that Coligny had just survived an assassination attempt, and he knew the storm could no longer be stopped. But others whispered that he himself had given the order to the soldiers, whether directly or through intermediaries. Historians still debate whether Charles was the mastermind, or just a young king pushed downhill without time to resist. You see, this is the point. History is like an old painting. The closer you look, the more layers of paint you see. The outermost layer shows a cold-blooded king giving the order, "Kill them all, so none are left alive to accuse me." But beneath that layer may lie the face of a 22-year-old youth, trembling with fear, yet forced to appear strong. Like when you are handed a massive task with no training, you might try to do it. But inside, you just want to escape. Within a few days, Paris fell into chaos. Radical Catholics hunted down Protestants, and the death toll is estimated to have reached tens of thousands across France. This became one of the deepest wounds in the history of European religion. You can imagine, if social media had existed then, the trend would have been flooded with engravings, pamphlets, poems of outrage or praise. Depending on the writer's side, strangely, amid it all, Charles did not completely disappear behind locked doors. Some said he walked onto a balcony, watching the streets in turmoil, his gaze following groups of people fleeing or chasing. Some witnesses claimed he was silent. Others swore they heard him shouting words of encouragement. No one knows for sure. And perhaps that is why his image remains blurred between two extremes, the tyrant king or the manipulated victim. After the massacre, Charles began to change. He rarely appeared in public, or rather, when he did, he no longer looked like a confident young king. Constant coughing, broken breaths, and eyes staring into nothingness, all made courtiers whisper about his health and his mind. Some physicians diagnosed melancholia, depression, imbalance of the humours, which in those days was often blamed on fate or God's punishment. But there was something few dared to mention. Strange habits began to surface. Charles slept irregularly, often waking in the middle of the night to wander the palace. He could sit for hours in a dark room, listening to the same piece of music on repeat. Servants said he sometimes ordered the bed linens changed because blood had seeped through, though in reality no one ever saw any stain. Historians still argue whether these signs were due to tuberculosis, later believed to be the cause of his death, or the result of slow poisoning, perhaps by political enemies, or even from the medicines his mother gave him to control his moods. You might think, if I had lived then, I would have run away from this palace at once. But for Charles, escape was not an option. He was bound by the crown and by a mother determined to keep him within her grasp. Catherine de' Medici was not only his mother, she was also his lifelong overseer, refusing to let him leave the chessboard of power, even when the piece was already cracked. Some records suggest that Catherine, though strict and cold, did at times show genuine care. She summoned the best physicians in Europe to treat him, exposed him to relics, holy water, and all manner of remedies. But that affection, if it existed, always came with a political goal to keep Charles strong enough to remain on the throne, at least until she could arrange a smooth succession. In his final years, Charles became unpredictable. He might be laughing and suddenly start trembling, or abruptly demand to see his brother Henry to bombard him with questions about loyalty. Court ceremonies, once elaborate and orderly, turned into tense gatherings where everyone spoke cautiously, as if walking on thin ice. You know, what makes this story both sad and chilling is this: behind all the rumors of a cannibal prince or a bloodthirsty king lies the image of a young man born without choice, raised in a world where suspicion and violence were the official language, a world where even maternal love was mixed with political strategy. And if tonight you feel a slight chill down your spine, it is understandable, because what happened in Charles's life is not only a story of the past, it serves as a reminder any system of power, without restraint and compassion, can turn a human being, especially a young one, into a tool for ruthless decisions. So sit still, take a deep breath, because this next part will feel as if we are stepping into a room where candlelight flickers faintly and the air is heavy with medicine, sweat, and that dampness only ancient stone walls can hold. The last months of Charles IX's life passed slowly, like a play on repeat, except that each day the main character grew weaker. Tuberculosis, if that truly was the cause, ate away at him from the inside out. Every morning, the king's cough echoed through the corridors, long and hoarse, sometimes ending with a few drops of blood on a handkerchief. At times, he stared at them as though reading an unavoidable omen. One event officially recorded in history in early 1574. The French court had nearly accepted the truth that the king did not have long left. But politics, as you know, never allows a power vacuum to last. Catherine de' Medici quietly prepared for Henry Charles's younger brother to leave Poland and return to take the throne. What is striking and somewhat strange is that, while physicians worked desperately to heal him, his mother spent most of her time arranging the succession, like a shopkeeper who orders a new sign before the old store has closed. One little known detail during this period: Charles began collecting bones. No one knew their origin. Some whispered they came from royal crypts. Others hinted they were the remains of victims from the St. Bartholomew massacre, secretly brought back. He kept them by his bed, gave each a name, and sometimes whispered to them like old friends. Historians still debate how real this was. Some say it was merely collective imagination, exaggerating to turn Charles into a haunting legend. Others believe it truly reflected his mental collapse. The closer the end came, the more paranoid he became. One day, he forced his mother to taste all his food in front of him, fearing poison. Another day, he erupted in anger because a servant entered the room too softly, startling him. On yet another, he sat for hours, staring into the fireplace, claiming to see Coligny's eyes watching him from the coals. If smartphones had existed, he probably would have set cameras everywhere and still not felt safe. Yet amid these disordered moments, Charles sometimes appeared fragile and profoundly human. He thought of Marie Touchet, the Protestant mistress, who alone could calm his panic and their little son. In letters to Marie, he wrote with a tenderness so striking that it is hard to believe they came from a king shrouded in infamy. He called her the star in my darkness. You see, even a figure history branded as a monster had hidden corners full of affection. In his final days, Charles's body wasted away. Eyes sunken, lips cracked and dry. He could drink little more than thin broth, and even that he often vomited. The room reeked of medicine, damp, and the stench of sickness, merging into a thick, suppressive air. You can imagine servants taking turns wiping his sweat and changing his sheets, working while holding their breath. Then came the 30th of May, 1574. Charles exhaled his last breath at the age of 23. History records that he died after a violent seizure, a cry bursting out and then fading, and as if a lamp had been extinguished, darkness filled the room. Yet in that darkness, the air felt lighter. The court did not wail loudly. Instead, the common feeling was one of release both for him and for a France exhausted by years of turmoil. Charles's death opened a series of questions. Did he die of illness or of slow poisoning? Were the stories of the Cannibal Prince rooted in truth, or merely the product of wartime religious propaganda? Historians still argue, and likely will for a long time, for evidence is scarce, while legend runs deep. His funeral was hurried. The body, already decomposing quickly, was embalmed and perfumed. But the foul smell could not be masked. He was buried in the Basilica of Saint Denis, among other kings, men who had died with greater honor. But there, in the cold stone and shadows, Charles was not a king celebrated, but a silent full stop, one many wished to forget. And so, his legacy was treated the same way by history buried deep. But, as you and I both know, stories that are buried never truly disappear. They only lie still, waiting for someone to tell them again. Charles IX became a strange symbol, both culprit and victim, both a product of his time and the one who scarred that very time. If you look closely at old paintings or handwritten documents from the 16th century, Charles's image often drifts between two extremes: a youthful face with aged eyes, splendid clothing but a body curled inward, as if battling an invisible cold. Perhaps this is the truest picture: a young man forced to be king, caught in a machine of power he could not control, and crushed from within. And that is why this story, though nearly half a millennium has passed, still chills listeners, not only because of ghastly rumors, but because it reminds us that any system of power can consume the souls of those within it, even if they bear the title of king. You see, the Valois dynasty in Charles's time was like an old boat rocking in a storm. Religious wars not only divided the people, but also tore apart the network of powerful families. The radical Catholic faction, such as the Guise family, held terrifying military strength, while the Huguenots had quiet support from England and the Protestant states of Germany. Charles, in theory, was head of it all. But in reality, power was fragmented, each piece fought over like a cake broken into crumbs. One little-told historical fact is that even after the St. Bartholomew massacre, the major cities like La Rochelle or Montauban still resisted royal authority and maintained their defences. This meant that the victory of Charles and the Catholics in Paris was never truly complete. It was like winning one chess match, while enemy pieces still filled the board ready to start another game as soon as you slipped. Strangely, France at that time still tried to maintain the facade of a kingdom of order so as not to lose face with neighbouring powers. Court ceremonies, banquets, parades were still held, like a shop on the verge of bankruptcy keeping its sign lit, and its window displays polished to reassure customers. In those moments, Charles had to play the role of a healthy, cheerful king. Even though inside he was collapsing both in body and spirit, historians still debate whether Catherine de' Medici truly believed she was protecting France, or whether she was simply protecting her family's power. For if you look at the outcome, her policies only prolonged the wars instead of ending them, and the way she used her son as a placeholder on the throne just to buy more time raises questions about the limits of maternal love when placed in the context of absolute power. If we place Charles in the modern world, you could compare him to a young CEO suddenly appointed to the highest position when the company was on the verge of collapse. Around him was a board of directors split into rival factions, shareholders demanding a leadership shake-up, and the media constantly spinning rumors. In such a situation, any decision could easily be exaggerated or distorted, and that very pressure made the leader begin to doubt both allies and himself. One interesting, often overlooked detail: Charles's final years coincided with Europe's entry into the so-called Little Ice Age, a period of unusual cold that led to failed harvests and famine in many regions. This contributed to growing social tension, for hungry people were more easily drawn into violent movements or rebellions. You see, sometimes the great upheavals of history were influenced by very earthly factors, like weather or disease. The image of Charles IX, therefore, cannot be viewed only through the lens of a mad king or a cannibal prince. He was also a product of an age where power and religion were tightly entwined, compounded by a world unstable, both politically and environmentally. The question is, if Charles had been born in a more stable time, he would have become a different kind of king. I think this is where history always leaves us space for reflection. Like when you look at an old painting and notice a tiny crack in the paint. You wonder, did that crack exist when it was first painted? Or was it created by time? And the elements Charles may have had inherent psychological fragility, but it was the crown and the context of his age that pushed those weaknesses into tragedy. And then, after Charles's death, his successor Henry III could not escape the same spiral. France remained mired in conflict, plots and assassinations unfolding one after another. What people call the last Valois period was like a long play in which each act ended with the main character drenched in sweat, blood, and tears. Yet the audience, the political forces, sat still, waiting for the next act. And so, his legacy was handled by history, in the same way buried deep. But, as you and I both know, stories that are buried never truly vanish. They simply lie still, waiting for someone to tell them again. Charles IX became a strange symbol, both perpetrator and victim, both a product of his era and the one who left scars upon it. If you notice, in old paintings or handwritten records from the 16th century, Charles's image often drifts between two extremes. A youthful face with aged eyes, splendid attire but a posture curled inward, as if bracing against an unseen cold. Perhaps this is the truest image, a young man forced into kingship, caught in a machine of power he could not control, and crushed from within. And that is why this story, though nearly half a millennium has passed, still makes listeners shiver, not only because of the ghastly rumors, but because it reminds us that any system of power can swallow the souls of those within it, even if they bear the title of king. You see, the Valois dynasty at the time of Charles was like an old boat rocking in a storm. Religious wars not only divided the people, but also shattered the web of alliances among powerful families. The radical Catholic faction, such as the Guise family, held terrifying military strength, while the Huguenots had secret support from England and the Protestant states of Germany. Charles, in theory, was the head of all. But in reality, power was splintered and fought over like a cake broken into crumbs. One little-told historical fact is that even after the St. Bartholomew massacre, major cities, such as La Rochelle or Montauban, still resisted royal authority and maintained their defences. This meant that the victory of Charles and the Catholics in Paris was never a complete victory. It was like winning one chess match while enemy pieces still filled the board, ready to start another game as soon as you slipped. Strangely, France at that time still tried to maintain the facade of a kingdom of order, so as not to lose face with neighbouring nations. Court ceremonies, banquets, parades were still held, like a shop on the brink of bankruptcy, keeping its sign lit and its display polished to reassure customers. In those events, Charles had to play the role of a healthy, cheerful king, though inside he was decaying both in body and spirit. Historians still debate whether Catherine de' Medici truly believed she was protecting France, or whether she was simply protecting her family's power. For if you judge by the outcome, her policies only prolonged the wars instead of ending them, and the way she used her son as a placeholder on the throne simply to buy more time raises questions about the limits of maternal love when placed in the context of absolute power. If you place Charles in modern times, you might compare him to a young CEO suddenly appointed to the top position when the company was on the brink of collapse. Around him was a board of directors split into rival factions, shareholders demanding a leadership shake-up, and the media constantly spinning rumors. In such a situation, any decision could easily be exaggerated or distorted, and that very pressure made the leader begin to doubt both his allies and himself. One interesting fact few notice: Charles's last years coincided with the period Europe entered the so-called Little Ice Age, an unusually cold climate that ruined harvests and caused famine in many regions. This added to social tension. For starving, people were more easily drawn into violent movements or rebellions. You see, sometimes the great upheavals of history were influenced by very earthly factors, like weather or disease. The image of Charles IX, therefore, cannot be viewed solely through the lens of a mad king or a cannibal prince. He was also a product of a time when power and religion were tightly entwined, compounded by a world unstable, both politically and naturally. The question is, if Charles had been born in a more stable era, would he have become a different king? I think this is the point where history always leaves us space for reflection. Like when you look at an old painting and notice a small crack in the paint. You wonder, did that crack exist from the beginning? Or did time and environment create it? Charles may have had fragile psychological tendencies, but it was the crown and the age that turned fragility into tragedy. And then, after Charles's death, his successor, Henry III, could not escape the same spiral. France continued to drown in conflict, with plots and assassinations following one another. What people call the last Valois period was like a long play in which each act ended with the main character drenched in sweat, blood, and tears. Yet the audience, the political forces remained seated, waiting for the next act. You see, expanding the story of Charles IX not only helps us understand an individual, but also a system, a machine of power that, once set in motion, crushed anyone, king or commoner. And that is also why whispers about him still exist to this day. Like a warning from the past to the present, we now drift further along the current of history. From the death of Charles IX into the reign of Henry III, the successor and one of the final links in the chain of Valois tragedy. Picture this: the year 1574. Paris had just endured a hurried funeral. While Charles's body was barely cold in the crypt of Saint Denis, Catherine de' Medici had already sent messengers across the routes, dispatching secret letters and summons for Henry, then in Poland, as king, to return at once. This was no short journey. And for Henry, it was like receiving an urgent call from the family business. Your brother has retired permanently. Come back immediately to take the post. Henry III, full name Alexandre Edouard, was the fourth son of Catherine and Henry II. Before ascending the French throne, he had been sent to Poland as a strategic pawn. And, surprisingly, the Polish people did not entirely dislike him. But for a Valois, homeland always outweighed a foreign crown. Hearing of Charles's death, Henry immediately abandoned the Krakow court, mounted his horse, and rode across nearly half of Europe to Paris. Perhaps if Google Maps had existed then, the route would have been marked with countless red warnings of high political risk. History records that when Henry returned to France, Catherine had arranged everything to ensure the succession went smoothly. She remained the one holding the reins, while Henry, at least in the beginning, only needed to play the part of a promising young king. But if you think Henry would be completely different from Charles, I'm sorry. That is only half true. Henry was indeed different. He was healthier, calmer, and far more able to keep his emotions hidden. But different did not mean better. One little-known fact: Henry III was famous for being highly concerned with his appearance. He often wore intricately embroidered robes, used expensive perfumes, and liked decorating the palace with lavish items. Sometimes far beyond the budget. He even created a circle of close attendants called les mignons, young men dressed flamboyantly, with glossy curled hair, sometimes even wearing cosmetics. The people of Paris at the time were both curious and scandalized, unsure if this was a new courtly fashion or an eccentric power play. Historians still debate whether this was mere personal taste or Henry's way of consolidating power by creating an unusual circle of loyalists, separating himself from traditional nobles. But no matter how finely dressed, Henry could not hide the truth that France was still bleeding. The religious wars had not stopped after the St. Bartholomew massacre. On the contrary, they were like a wound, cut even deeper. Major cities remained in rebellion. Huguenot leaders continued to forge alliances abroad, and the radical Catholics were more determined than ever to annihilate their enemies. Henry, like his brother before him, stood between two raging waves. But he chose a different path, focusing on ritual, festivals, and things that could make him feel powerful without spilling blood directly. Yet, do not assume Henry was a king entirely detached from reality. He could act decisively. The most famous official event was the assassination of Henri I, Duc de Guise. In 1588, the Guise family, leaders of the radical Catholic faction, had become a thorn in Henry III's side. And during a meeting at the Château de Blois, Henry had the Duke killed right in his chamber, then declared, "At last, I am truly King of France." In modern terms, this would be like a CEO firing a rival during a board meeting, but by permanent means. This led to one lesser-known detail outside scholarly circles. The death of the Duc de Guise ignited a new crisis, as many Catholic cities revolted against Henry III, seeing him as a traitor. And once he had lost the trust of both sides, Huguenot and radical Catholic Henry had only one path left: a temporary alliance with Henry of Navarre, the same man who had married his sister Marguerite in that fateful wedding years earlier. Historians still debate whether this was a clever strategy or simply a last resort. This alliance gave Henry III more military strength, but at the same time made many radical Catholics see him as a traitor to the faith. And then, Henry III's fate arrived in August 1589, when he was assassinated by a fanatical Catholic monk named Jacques Clément. Henry received a fatal stab wound. But before he died, he managed to designate Henry of Navarre as his successor, paving the way for the Bourbon dynasty. Looking more broadly, we see that Charles IX and Henry III were two different pieces of the same picture: a Valois dynasty exhausted, torn apart by religious wars, noble rivalries, and family intrigues. Charles died young, broken in body and spirit. Henry died while trying to assert control through sudden blows, only to be betrayed by the very religion he defended. One interesting detail that shows the repetition of history: both brothers were surrounded by rumors. Charles was haunted by whispers of cannibalism, whether true or not, no one could ever prove. Henry was rumored to be too close to his les mignons and detached from the daily realities of his people. Both lived and ruled in the enormous shadow of their mother, Catherine de' Medici, who was both the architect of power and the one who set the limits they could never cross. And when the Valois house collapsed, people did not only speak of a dynastic change, but also of the end of an era of politics built on strategic marriages, courtly assassinations, and prophecies guiding state decisions. The Bourbon era began with Henry IV, formerly Henry of Navarre, bringing a different style, more pragmatic, focused on unifying the nation and reviving the economy. Yet the ghosts of chaos lingered in the minds of the people, and stories of the Cannibal Prince or the Silken King were whispered by fireplaces for centuries afterward. Now imagine yourself sitting in an old Paris cafe, looking out at the cobblestone streets. Perhaps you are sitting exactly where crowds once gathered for the wedding procession of Marguerite and Henry of Navarre, or where the wave of violence swept through on St. Bartholomew's night. Those stones are silent, but if they could speak, they would surely tell a story, not much different from what you just heard, only slower. Respire, as if the smell of smoke and blood still lingered. And that, precisely, is the invisible legacy left by Charles IX and Henry III, not monuments. Reforms, all glorious victories, but the collective memory of a dynasty torn apart from within. It became a reminder that power, when placed in the hands of people crushed by intrigue and pressure, does not create great leaders but tragic figures, remembered by history as mirrors of decline. Now, picture yourself leaving the dark scenery of the Valois court and stepping into another morning, the morning of 1589. When France awoke to the news that Henry III had been assassinated, the palace was in turmoil, the great cities abuzz, and somewhere, a figure familiar to us already, Henry of Navarre now stood as Henry IV of France. Henry IV was no stranger. Do you remember? He was the groom in the fateful wedding of 1572, the man who escaped death in the St. Bartholomew massacre by temporarily converting to Catholicism. Official history records that in the years after, Henry IV switched back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism, not out of weakness, but because it was the only way to survive and maintain his forces in a France full of contradictions. One little-known fact: before officially becoming king, Henry IV had to fight for 4 years in what was called the War of the Three Henrys, a strange civil war where all three main figures shared the same name: Henry III, King of France, Henry of Navarre, leader of the Huguenots, and Henry, Duc de Guise, leader of the radical Catholics. The story reads like a historical novel where the author forgot to give the characters different names to avoid confusion. Historians still debate whether Henry IV was truly a born reconciler or a shrewd strategist who simply chose the least bloody path to consolidate power. But clearly, when he entered Paris as king, He carried an energy entirely different from Charles IX or Henry III. No more panicked eyes or extravagant airs, but the toughness of a man who had lived his whole life between battlefield and negotiation. Henry IV understood that to rule a France torn apart by religious wars, he first had to make the people feel safe. And so he made a historic decision in 1593. He publicly converted permanently to Catholicism, with the famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass." This was a moment some saw as a betrayal of ideals, but most breathed a sigh of relief at last. The country had a chance at peace. One interesting detail rarely mentioned: Henry IV did not only reconcile religions, he also carried out deep economic reforms. He encouraged vineyard planting, expanded trade, and placed particular emphasis on agriculture. A popular saying of the time spread that Henry IV wished every French peasant to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday, a slogan that sounded very much like marketing, but it made him a king, close to the people. Yet reconciling Catholics and Protestants was not easy. The Edict of Nantes, in 1598, issued by Henry IV, guaranteed religious freedom for the Huguenots, to a degree never before seen. Historians still debate its impact. Some call it a model of religious tolerance. Others say it was only a temporary fix, a patch over a deep wound. And as if in a fated cycle, Henry IV too did not escape a violent end. In 1610, he was assassinated by François Ravaillac, a radical Catholic fanatic. His death left France in the hands of his 9-year-old son Louis XIII, opening a new chapter with the rise of Cardinal Richelieu and further shifts of power. But if you place Henry IV alongside Charles IX and Henry III, the contrast is striking. Charles IX was the image of a king drowned in pressure and obsession. Henry III was the ceremonial monarch, skillful yet lonely and suspicious. Henry IV was the pragmatist, knowing when to wield the sword, when to extend a hand, and not afraid to sacrifice reputation for a greater goal. You see, the story of these three kings is not just three separate destinies. They link together like three acts of the same tragedy, beginning with internal collapse, Charles IX, continuing with power games and hollow rituals, Henry III, and ending with an attempt to heal the nation, Henry IV. And if you look closely, the shadow of Catherine de' Medici lingers through all three acts. She did not live to see the death of Henry IV. But the strategies and legacy she left had already shaped the board for the entire century. Perhaps this is the moment for you and me to slow down, to look at the bigger picture. From the St. Bartholomew massacre, through political assassinations, to the Edict of Nantes, all of it shows one truth. 16th century France was living proof that absolute power never stands still. It shifts, changes hands, and often leaves behind wounds that many generations must still bear. Henry III died in the summer of 1589, and the news spread quickly like a fierce wind through the damp corridors of the palace. One stab from Jacques Clement, a radical Catholic monk, ended the life of the last Valois king. That death not only extinguished the light on the throne, but also brought a wave of emptiness and chaos. In that moment, France seemed to stand at the edge of a cliff, with the question, who will rule, unanswered? And the answer, by law of succession, was Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot leader who had survived the St. Bartholomew massacre by temporarily converting to Catholicism. But in a nation still overwhelmingly Catholic, the idea of a Protestant king was like pouring oil on the flames of conflict. Many cities declared they did not recognize Henry, and the Radical Catholic League built barricades everywhere. Henry, at that point still a king in name, understood that he needed more than military victories. He needed one decisive act to open the gates of Paris, the city still loyal to the Catholic cause, and move himself from outside the walls into the royal palace. The decision came in 1593. He publicly converted to Catholicism, with the historic phrase, "Paris is worth a mass." Historians still debate whether this was a genuine change of faith or a cold political move, but the effect cannot be denied only a year later. Henry IV was officially crowned at Chartres, ascending the throne as the founder of the Bourbon dynasty, a dynasty that would last until the end of the 18th century. Once secure on the throne, Henry IV began rebuilding a nation exhausted after more than 3 decades of religious wars, and to soothe wounds, in 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, allowing Huguenots the right to worship in certain places, to hold public office, and to maintain garrisons in some towns. This was an unprecedented decision in Europe at the time. But a curious detail in Paris: copies of the edict were distributed sparingly, because officials feared radical Catholics would riot if they read every clause. Henry IV did not stop at religious reconciliation. He spent years restoring agriculture, encouraging vineyards, mulberry planting for silk, and expanding trade. The people called him Le Bon Roi Henri, the good King Henry, not only because he improved the economy, but also because of his image as a king who often disguised himself to visit his subjects. Listening to small stories in markets and taverns, from these visits came his famous wish that every peasant's family might have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. But power and popularity did not shield him from fanaticism. In 1610, Henry IV was assassinated by François Ravaillac, a Catholic zealot, in the streets of Paris. Ravaillac insisted before his execution that he believed the king was plotting against the church. Historians remain divided to this day. Did he act alone? Or was he the tool of a larger political force? The death of Henry IV placed his 9-year-old son, Louis XIII, on the throne. And as in a cycle once seen in Valois times, the crown again lay on a child's head. While real power belonged to his mother, this time Marie de Medici, she became regent. But, unlike Catherine de Medici, Marie was less shrewd and relied heavily on advisors, especially Cardinal Richelieu later on. Under Louis XIII and Richelieu, the Bourbons began reshaping France toward concentrating absolute power in the king. Paris was expanded, the army modernized, and France's position in Europe rose significantly. But these reforms also laid the groundwork for a form of absolute monarchy that would reach its peak under Louis XIV, the Sun King, the successor of Louis XIII, who raised royal power to nearly total dominance. If we look back over the path from Charles IX to Henry IV, we see a spiral of tragedy and change. Charles IX, a fragile soul shattered under the weight of the crown and spilled blood. Henry III, a sharp mind but trapped in webs of intrigue and betrayal. Henry IV, a pragmatist who healed wounds, but still fell to the dagger of an extremist. All three reflect a truth that 16th century France carved deeply absolute power, when placed amid division and extremism, turns every person, whether weak, wise, or well-meaning, into a tragic figure. And as the Bourbons continued to rule, the ghosts of Valois lingered, plots, assassinations, and a France constantly asking whether peace could ever truly last. When Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, the throne was given to Louis XIII, only 9 years old. As in the stories of the Valois, a child wearing the crown meant another hand held power. This time it was Marie de Medici, widow of Henry IV, who became regent. She was an ambitious woman, but lacked Catherine de Medici's political finesse. Marie leaned toward the conservative Catholic faction, and these biased decisions soon caused discontent among nobles and cities that had once supported Henry IV. One little-known detail: only a few years after becoming regent, Marie ordered the construction of the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, inspired by the Pitti Palace in Florence, her homeland. The building was not just a residence, but a declaration of power: I am here to rule. But it also consumed vast sums from the treasury. While France's economy had not yet fully recovered from war, Louis XIII officially took power in 1617, and his first move was to strip his mother of influence. Marie was sent into political exile at Blois, a cold but necessary step for Louis to prove he was not merely the son of Henry IV, but an independent king. The era of Louis XIII is forever tied to another name, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu was not only an advisor, but the true architect of France's power. Turning the Bourbon monarchy into a strong, centralized regime, he reinforced royal authority by crushing the influence of feudal nobles and suppressing remaining Huguenot strongholds, most notably in the campaign at La Rochelle in 1627-1628. Historians still debate Richelieu. Did he save France? Or did he lay the foundation for a despotic regime that would end in revolution? But one thing is certain, he prepared everything so that Louis XIII's successor, Louis XIV, could rule without sharing power with anyone. Louis XIV ascended in 1643, at only 4.5 years old. After his father's death, once again, France fell into the hands of a regent, this time Anne of Austria, Louis's mother, alongside the powerful new advisor Cardinal Mazarin. The childhood of Louis XIV was marked by the Fronde, a series of noble and urban revolts against centralization. The boy king had to flee Paris at night, witnessing firsthand the siege of the palace. This memory etched into Louis an obsession never again to allow nobles and the people of Paris to challenge the throne. As an adult, he turned this obsession into policy, centralizing all power in the monarch's hands and transforming the nobility into dependence on his favor. A most symbolic decision was moving the court from Paris to Versailles, a magnificent palace he built from a small hunting lodge. Versailles was not merely a residence, but a stage where every ritual, from the king's waking to his sleeping, became a performance of power. Nobles who wished to be favored had to live there, following the rhythm set by the king. A curious fact, few noticed Louis XIV had a public lever du roi royal waking, where grandees took turns, watching the king get dressed. This was not just an eccentric habit, but a political tool turning service into the highest honor, forcing nobles to compete for proximity to the monarch. In foreign affairs, Louis XIV waged numerous wars to expand territory, making France the leading power in Europe, but endless warfare drained the treasury. Even as Versailles shone like a colossal jewel, historians still debate whether the Sun King was the model of a great ruler or the symbol of extravagance that led to long-term decline. When Louis XIV died in 1715, he left behind a France both powerful and weary. His extravagance and absolute power had become legend, but at the same time sowed seeds of discontent, especially among the middle class and common people. The Bourbon dynasty would continue along the path of absolutist monarchy until it met the storm of revolution at the end of the 18th century. And if you look back at the journey from Charles IX to Louis XIV, you will see a continuous thread from a Valois dynasty torn apart by civil and religious wars, to a Bourbon dynasty that rose to unify the nation, consolidate power, and then push that centralization to the absolute extreme. Each king, each figure, whether fragile, ceremonial, or pragmatic, contributed a piece to the picture of French power until it became both dazzling and so fragile that a single wave of uprising could sweep it away. Louis XIV died on a September morning in 1715, leaving Versailles in an atmosphere both solemn and relieved. Solemn because the Sun King had been a symbol for more than 7 decades. Relieved because after endless wars and costly constructions, the treasury was nearly empty, and the people exhausted. The king lay there on his gilded bed, but his legacy was a France at once, at the height of power and drowning in debt. The throne was passed to his great-grandson Louis XV, only 5 years old, and like an old refrain repeated since Valois times, when the king was a child, power belonged to someone else. This time it was Philippe, Duke of Orleans, who acted as regent. This was a period when Versailles lost some of the rigid ceremonial discipline of Louis XIV, replaced instead by parties, balls, and rumors. Louis XV grew into a man of charming appearance, but with a complicated personality, both shy before the work of government and deeply absorbed in the pleasures of court life. Historians note a paradox. He had a good memory and understood Europe's situation well, yet often neglected important decisions, delegating them to ministers, while immersing himself in hunting, dancing, and affairs. One little-known fact: Louis XV strongly believed in omens and prophecies. Once he was warned that France's fate will fall into the hands of revolution if the court continued to detach from the people, he only sneered, dismissing it as a threat. Yet in truth, under his reign, the gap between Versailles and real life outside grew ever wider, like a gaping chasm. In policy, Louis XV sometimes tried to maintain France's position in Europe through war and diplomacy. But wars such as the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, ended disastrously. France lost many colonies in North America and India to Britain, diminishing its international standing. Worse, the costly wars ballooned public debt. While taxes weighed heavily on peasants and the middle class who gained nothing from the court's extravagance, historians still debate how to judge Louis XV. Some called him the beloved king le bien-aimé in his early years because of his gentle character and charm. But later, the title turned into irony, as people saw him as a symbol of moral decline and political weakness. When Louis XV died in 1774, the throne passed to his grandson Louis XVI, only 20 years old. This was a crucial transition, for Louis XVI would be the one to witness and be swept into the storm of revolution. Louis XVI was unlike the previous kings of Versailles. He truly wished to do good for the country, but lacked the will to carry out necessary reforms. Personally, he was gentle, fond of science, mechanics, and particularly lockmaking. Anecdotes tell that during council meetings, while ministers debated passionately, the king would sit quietly, tinkering with a lock on the table. A harmless hobby, yet a symbolic image of a king out of step with his time. His wife, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess, became the center of attention as soon as she entered Versailles. Young, beautiful, and fond of fashion, she was quickly tied to an image of extravagance and waste. Though many tales about her were exaggerated, such as the "let them eat cake" line, in the eyes of starving people, Marie Antoinette became the emblem of a court completely detached from reality. The international context also did not favor Louis XVI. In 1778, France joined in support of America's War of Independence against Britain, partly out of a desire to avenge its defeat in the 7 Years' War. Although the Americans eventually won, the campaign sent French public debt soaring. The treasury, already weak, was left in ruin. To rescue the finances, Louis XVI sought to reform the tax system, requiring even nobles and the church long exempt from taxation to contribute. But when he summoned the Estates General in 1789 to address the issue, he unintentionally opened the door to the revolutionary movement. The Estates General quickly turned into a forum of resistance. The Third Estate, representing the commoners and the bourgeoisie, declared itself the National Constituent Assembly, vowing not to dissolve until France had a new constitution. This event was like a drumbeat opening the play. From there, protests spread widely, culminating on the 14th of July, 1789, when the people of Paris stormed and captured the Bastille, the symbol of absolutist power. Louis XVI, at first, tried to compromise. He accepted some of the revolution's demands, but still hoped to preserve the monarchy in a constitutional form. The problem was, trust between the king and the people had collapsed. Every move he made was suspected of being a plot to restore absolute power. One little-known fact: in June 1791, Louis XVI and his family attempted to escape Paris in the event known as the Flight to Varennes. They planned to flee to the border, where loyal forces remained. and from there, rally troops against the revolution. But the plan failed when they were recognized and captured. This event completely destroyed the king's image in the eyes of the people, from being seen as weak but harmless to traitor to the nation. From here, the story rushed toward the abyss. In 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished, and Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. The trial was tense, mixing legal arguments with political passions. In the end, he was sentenced to death. On the 21st of January, 1793, at the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, Louis XVI climbed the scaffold. The air was cold, the wind slicing across the square packed with people. The king spoke a few brief words, declaring his innocence and wishing blessings for France. But the drums of the soldiers drowned him out. The guillotine blade fell, closing over 1,000 years of French monarchy dating back to the Merovingians. Marie Antoinette met the same fate only a few months later. And Versailles, once the beating heart of power, became an empty palace, stripped of political role by the revolution, left only as a symbol of a vanished splendor. Looking back over the journey from Charles IX to Louis XVI, you will see a great circle of power and collapse. From a fragile Valois dynasty, torn apart by civil war and religion, to a strong Bourbon line, centralized, reaching its peak under Louis XIV, then sliding down into extravagance and debt, until the people could bear no more. Historians still debate, were the fates of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette the inevitable result of centuries of absolutist rule, or simply the personal tragedy of two figures caught in a time changing too quickly? But one thing is certain: once the distance between palace and square grows too vast, the history will find a way to level it. And that is how the drumbeat at the Bastille connected with the guillotine's fall in the square too, sounds that opened and closed the final chapter of French monarchy. After the 21st of January, 1793, Paris sank into a strange tension. The guillotine was no longer a special tool, but became the daily rhythm of the revolution. Anyone deemed a traitor, noble or commoner, could be dragged to the square. Marie Antoinette, once parading in embroidered gowns beneath Versailles' gilded ceilings, now stood on the cramped wooden platform of the execution machine. Her hair cut short, so the blade would not snag. She died in October 1793. Before a crowd both gleeful and curious, France entered its first republic. But republic here did not mean stability. The National Convention, then the Committee of Public Safety, and figures like Robespierre took turns, ruling. All believed they were building a new order, but in reality, the country remained drenched in violence and turmoil. One detail few notice is that, while Paris boiled, in distant villages, some still lit candles and prayed for the legitimate king, not Louis XVI, who was dead, but his son, Louis Charles, only 8 years old. In the eyes of Bourbon loyalists, that boy was Louis XVII, but in reality, he was imprisoned in the Temple Tower, and he would never be free. His mysterious death in 1795, some sources say from illness, others from poisoning, became one of the great controversies of French history. In that vacuum of power and instability, a new figure rose: Napoleon Bonaparte. From a Corsican artillery officer, Napoleon used military talent and political acumen to step into the center of power. In 1799, he staged a coup, establishing the consulate, later declaring himself first consul. But Napoleon did not stop there. In 1804, he crowned himself emperor at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, a gesture both defying the Pope and sending a clear message: my power comes from no one but myself. Under Napoleon, the French Empire spread across Europe, from Spain to Poland. But like every empire that rises too quickly, it came to an end. Defeat in Russia in 1812 and the United European Coalition brought Napoleon down in 1814. And this was the moment when the seemingly impossible happened. The Bourbon dynasty returned to the throne. The man brought back was Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI. He returned to Paris not on a war horse, but in the carriages of the Allied forces that had defeated Napoleon. Louis XVIII, heavy-set and in poor health, knew well that he could not rule as the Bourbons had before the Revolution. He accepted the new constitution, maintained some of Napoleon's reforms, and tried to balance between the hardline royalists and those who had once supported the revolution. However, the Bourbons did not remain secure for long. In 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France in the event known as the 100 Days. Quickly rallying the army and reclaiming power, Louis XVIII fled, and only after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo did the Bourbons return once more. After Louis XVIII came Charles X, his brother, and also the uncle of the ill-fated Louis XVII. Charles X was far more conservative, seeking to restore many of the privileges of the nobility and the church, which angered the people. The breaking point came in 1830, when he issued the July ordinances restricting press freedom and altering the electoral system in favor of the aristocracy. Paris erupted in the July Revolution, and in just 3 days, Charles X was forced to abdicate and flee to England. This time, the Bourbons did not return to the throne. The crown was handed to Louis Philippe, the citizen king of the Orleans branch of the royal family. Though still a monarchy, this era was more constitutional and heavily pressured by the rising industrial middle class. And so, if we trace the line from Charles IX in the 16th century to Louis Philippe in the 19th century, we see a winding journey, a dynasty that nearly collapsed entirely, returned thanks to the shifting balance of Europe, then lost its place again for failing to keep pace with the age. Historians still debate whether the Bourbon restoration after Napoleon was a true revival or merely a transitional phase, a political courtesy granted by Europe's great powers to an old dynasty. But one thing is certain: once a regime has lost the trust of most of its people, even if it returns, it is only the shadow of itself. Today, when you walk through Versailles, you will still see the rooms of Louis XIV gleaming, the portraits of Henry IV still hanging with honor. But somewhere in the air, if you are attentive, you can sense the emptiness, not because the palace no longer houses kings, but because it was once the center of a system of power that seemed immortal, yet was ultimately swept away like specks of golden dust drifting in the evening sun. You know, in 21st century France, the story of the Bourbon kings does not just lie quietly in history books. It is like the cobblestones of Paris. Everyone steps on them daily. A few notice. But when you bend down and look closely, you see the traces of centuries. Along the boulevards of Paris, you will see the names of streets, squares, bridges carrying Bourbon marks. Pont Neuf, the bridge built by Henry IV, still spans the Seine, and at its head, his equestrian statue still stands proudly. People call him Le Bon Roi, Henri, as a reminder of the king who once wished every peasant family to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. Historians still argue whether he truly said it or whether it was a later invention. But his statue still receives fresh flowers on anniversaries. Versailles is now a museum, but not the cold kind we often imagine. It lives through the footsteps of millions of visitors each year, lives through the gasps of awe upon entering the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors, where Louis XIV once signed treaties that shaped Europe's destiny. People come to admire the splendor, but then, in some corner, they will also read the small notes about public debt, about the court's detachment from the people, things that helped sow the seeds of revolution. The story of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette has been retold most often through film and novels. Some directors emphasize extravagance and excess, while others explore the tragic side of a young couple swept into the whirlwind of politics. The phrase, "let them eat cake," still echoes worldwide as a symbol of indifference, even though historians confirm that Marie Antoinette never said it. This proves a simple truth in collective memory. Fact and myth are always intertwined. As for Charles IX, the last Valois king before the Bourbons, the image of him lives more among history enthusiasts and scholars. Exhibitions about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre often mention his name, a reminder of a time when religion and power strangled France. Ordinary people may not remember the exact years of his reign, but the story of the king haunted into illness appears in many podcasts and history videos. A tale both chilling and pitiable. Interestingly, in modern politics, the images of kings are sometimes used as metaphors. A politician seen as overly centralized may be compared to Louis XIV, the Sun King. A leader remembered for closeness to the people may be likened to Henry IV. Even debates about the national budget sometimes include the phrase, "We cannot spend like 18th century Versailles." In schools, French students learn about the Bourbons, not merely as names on a throne, but as chapters in a grand novel of power, a strong beginning, a brilliant peak, then decline. Teachers often pose the question, if you were Louis XVI, what would you have done differently to avoid the revolution and exercise not only in history, but in leadership and responsibility? Writers, meanwhile, love to dive into everyday details to bring kings closer to readers. Louis XIV, with his elaborate lever du roi rituals that were essentially just a late morning wake-up. Louis XV, so devoted to hunting that he sometimes kept ministers waiting for hours. Henry IV, disguising himself to shop in the markets. Listening to people curse about taxes. These small stories help modern people feel that kings too were human with hobbies, habits, and moments of weakness. And finally, there is one reason the Bourbons still live in French memory architectural legacy. From Versailles, the Louvre, and Fontainebleau to bridges and squares, all remain stone witnesses of an age gone by. People may debate the political legacy of the Bourbons, but in art and architecture, a few deny their influence. Overall, the memory of the Bourbon dynasty in modern France is like a two-sided mirror, one side gleaming gold with power and culture, the other shadowed by tyranny and mistakes. The French do not forget, but neither do they remember one-sidedly. And perhaps that is the fairest way to tell the story of a dynasty that rose to the heights and fell to the depths, so that each generation, looking back, feels both admiration and caution. So, before we close tonight's book, imagine yourself standing in a silent corridor of Versailles. Moonlight pours through tall windows, casting across cold stone floors where footsteps have been quiet for centuries. No more court music. No more whispers of schemes. Only the breath of wind, the scent of old wood, and a trace of dried rose lingering in the air. You close your eyes and picture the figures who once passed here, a young king smiling at a ball, a queen quietly hiding her tears behind a silk fan, a child chasing a hunting dog up a spiral staircase. All have dissolved into time, like dew, vanishing under the morning sun. Yet somewhere, they still live not in palaces, but in memory, in stories, and in the very words we have just whispered to each other. Perhaps when you wake tomorrow, you will forget some details, but you will still remember this feeling that history, no matter how distant, you can still brush your shoulder like a reminder every crown is heavy, and every dynasty fragile. So let the lights soften. Let the hum of the fan become a slow lullaby. Relax your shoulders. Breathe deeply. And let the golden walls of Versailles fade into shadow. History will continue to live. And you need only sleep well. Wishing you a peaceful night.